What's the difference between a First Nations person and a Métis person? Why do First Nations people and Métis people not really get along?
So now what's happening is people are looking back, and since this whole era of ancestry.ca, where they're finding one connection to an Indigenous person somewhere down their line, are using that as criteria to say that they are Métis. There's no nationhood, there's no distinct culture, there's no language, there's no community. They're calling themselves a nation in Ontario here, the Métis Nation of Ontario. It's not a nation, it's a crown corporation.
I asked Chief Scott McLeod, the Chiefs of Ontario's spokesperson and Chief of Nipissing First Nation, why First Nations people and Métis people do not get along. And here's what he had to say.
Well, I lived as a white person all my life, but I do have a great grandmother who was Indigenous. So, and now I see the benefits. I can go hunting, I can go fishing, I can get education. So I'm Métis now. That's how we see it from our lens.
How would you describe the difference between like First Nations and Métis people?
The distinction, between Métis and Indigenous people is quite clear. The Indigenous nations in this country have been here since time immemorial. We have very obvious, distinct nations that have distinct cultures. You can come into our communities that are still here, that have always been here, and the people have always been here. We're connected to our territorial lands throughout Ontario, and I can't speak for Manitoba, but I'm sure it's quite similar there. And I reference Manitoba because we know, as Indigenous people who are well connected to our land, we know the histories of our territories, and we know that Métis, which is also a distinct nation of people and that developed a culture through time that was distinctly different from ours, and it evolved from the time of first contact and the centuries that followed, where what was considered to be half-breeds or mixed marriages, resulting in mixed children, who basically had commonality and began to start these communities outside of the Indigenous community. And they developed their own culture based on, some aspects of ours, some aspects of the European, but they became nations in areas around the Red River, Manitoba area, that basically got recognized as its own nation through time, because they developed their own practices and even their own language, which was a mixture of different languages, but very distinct. And they lived as basically a hybrid tribe of people, and were acknowledged as such. The notable difference, when you look at other areas such as Ontario, there's always been the mixed marriages, and as a result, some of those mixed children who had more children assimilated into modern colonial society, and some of them stayed with us. There was always that notion still that there was people classified as half-breeds, both within our communities and both outside of our communities, but it never developed into a distinct culture, a distinct nation of people. Right. So there was choices that were made by people, whether forcefully or other independent choices, where they chose to walk in the non-Indigenous world or to walk in the Indigenous world. So that's a big difference. You're missing in the entire what developed a nationhood in Manitoba through a similar process, but developed into a nation, to one that was just some of the same characteristics, but never developed into any nations. They became part of our nation, or they became part of mainstream society and lived as settlers for the centuries to come. So now what's happening is people are looking back, and since this whole era of ancestry.ca, where they're finding one connection to an Indigenous person somewhere down their line, are using that as criteria to say that they are Métis.
Right.
And that's the crook of the problem here, is that there's no nationhood, there's no distinct culture, there's no language, there's no community. They're calling themselves a nation in Ontario here, the Métis Nation of Ontario. It's not a nation. It's a crown corporation. There are no historic communities. They've gotten Ontario to recognize these 6 new historic communities. I don't know what a new historic is, kind of an oxymoron
Yeah.
to say new historic
It is.
communities that are planted right in our territories. And so we're opposing that recognition and saying, we are the first peoples of these territories, and to give any recognition to these other so-called nations cannot come without our consent,
Right.
because we know the history of our land, we know the history of our people, and they're using our ancestors to make some connection to justify, them having Section 35 Indigenous rights in our territories. And we're saying, well, first of all, no. Second of all, if you are entitled to any rights using our ancestors, you have to come to us. You have to come to the people that you're claiming to be descendants from to get that recognition, not some third party colonial government that is, fabricating these nations out of thin air into our territories. So that's the fundamental argument. And if you look at the criteria that M&O, which has been changing over the years because they're being pressured at every corner now, a lot of it is that has Indigenous ancestry as Métis, first of all, but some don't even have Indigenous ancestry.
That one thing that you just said, like using our ancestors to claim indigeneity, I think that that's a key piece that helps educate people on like the origin of what makes someone Métis. If my grandpa Carl first got hit, like if he was like one of the first arrivals and that had happened, when all of the Métis people were being created, would my dad not have been like a Métis person?
By the criteria, yeah. Like, I
Yeah.
mean, and that's what's so the irony of this whole thing is, by the criteria of that, the M&O are using, we're making Métis people every day. We have mixed marriages all the time, but that doesn't constitute a Métis person. Either they are part of our nation or part of the colonized nation, and we fully understand that some of that has occurred at the hands of legislation and colonial interference. We get that, but it still doesn't justify a Métis nation. It still doesn't justify having those collective rights for governance, and which will lead to other things such as natural resources and land in our territories.
I know you're so deep and close to this subject matter, as like this is your world, and I've never created content surrounding this topic. And for people that are kind of earlier in their journey to learning about Indigenous issues and the challenges of kind of intercultural racism or tension between Indigenous groups, some of that can be kind of foreign, even though they are like wanting to learn. But can you tell us like what some of those subtle or not so subtle tensions are between First Nations and Métis people, and like why there's that tension? I know you've spoke about it kind of because you're really close to it, but I think it's something that even in my experience growing up, like as a young child, like it was something that was there, but we didn't really talk about it.
Yeah, and it's the same pattern throughout our communities. It's ironic that I grew up in the 70s and a lot of the same people that I was fighting against racism and divisions and cultures are the same people now claiming to be Indigenous through this Métis lens. And it's also ironic that it's only happening now when governments are starting to realize that Indigenous people do have rights and are entitled to certain privileges generated from our resources and our lands. Now there's something at the end, there's a benefit. And I think that's what's, this socio-economic benefit is what's really driving, this whole identity shift to, well, I lived as a white person all my life, but I do have a great, 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 great grandmother who was Indigenous. So, and now I see the benefits. I can go hunting, I can go fishing, I can get education. So I'm Métis now. That's how we see it from our lens. That it's not driven by a true identity that you've carried all your life, that was passed on to you by your parents, that was practiced every day, that was lived every day. It's just become an environment that is of benefit now, and that's a bit of the tension that Indigenous people have towards. We were in the trenches, we suffered, we fought the fights, we were standing proud when we were spit on by Canadian society. So for us to see other people walking out of the bushes claiming to be one of us now, especially when it comes to residential schools and the suffering and the trauma, for them to hitch their wagon to it without having an ounce of the pain, having an ounce of the suffering, it is really, really disturbing and something that Indigenous communities resent, that we see happening. And so some of it is, like you say, subtle, some of it isn't so subtle, but it's, this is not lateral violence. This is pushing back people who are trying to occupy our spaces for benefit. That's what this is. We have no animosity or hatred or anything against Métis people, but we have to know who we're talking about here. Are they really Métis people? Are they people just trying to do whatever they can to get benefits of Indigenous people? Because those are two separate things. And there's like even Margaret Froh, who is the president of the Métis Nation of Ontario, isn't from Ontario. She's from Saskatchewan. And she may be a legitimate Métis person, but not from here. And that's all we're saying, is that Métis territories were not here. We cannot pick up our rights and go to Quebec or go to Alberta or Saskatchewan and say, well, I got rights here because I'm Indigenous, from Ontario. I have Scottish in my family tree. I can't go to Scotland and claim rights there, just because I have a great, 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 great grandfather who was a Hudson Bay employee from Scotland. It's ludicrous to think that I could do that in Scotland. But somehow it's not ludicrous that people can do it here in our territories and our nations. The whole thing is ironic and beyond ironic. It's quite disturbing to see, what we consider foreign governments as Ontario and Canada on our lands, giving away these rights to people without our consent, and just open freely, with very little due diligence on who these people are. And very little scrutiny on their criteria of determining their membership.
Yeah. And I work a lot with like large corporations that are, as a marketer, and they're trying to do well, I guess, as well as they're able. And I feel like as allies and as even people that are trying to understand like the complexities of the relationship, like provincially versus nationally, and how that fits in with the history of treaties, and even like the pan-Indigenous view of like First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and like kind of a lumping the group of all three groups together. I feel like it's a bizarre thing that I like. That's kind of my norm that I have to kind of navigate every day, and I don't have the privilege and the pleasure of having like these deep, like rich conversations. It's usually kind of like very beginner level. But the people that are kind of unaware, like you can't even get to the stage of really understanding the intricate details of the issues that are going on and how to support communities when you don't understand like the history of treaties and understand like how important those rights are, that we are like, you know, our understanding and our connection to our lands and things, and how that's so different for like Métis groups like that. Like, you know, I feel like it's not even like relevant to the conversation sometimes for them. Like what would your take on that be in kind of reframing that, the importance of understanding like history and treaties and how that was kind of like an agreement with the crown, it's not relevant really like provincially, and how we can kind of adjust those treaties and adjust our ways of thinking to these like provincial groups that exist.
Mainstream society tends not to put any stock into our knowledge or our history. When they refer to traditional knowledge, when it comes to the environment or our water, they talk as if it's below Western science, and that's the same for our historical knowledge, because it's not written in a book. But if you look at our traditional knowledge, I like to call it traditional science, because people that could then start to understand that this knowledge went through the same rigors as any scientific process. Trial and error, mistakes, and finding out what works, what doesn't. That's what science is, and that's what we've been doing here for millennia, and that's why we know the things that we know. And our history is the same thing. So to not give it any value because it wasn't recorded in these books, but instead it was passed through teachings, it was passed through ceremony, it was passed through oral communication, doesn't make it any less strong. And we've proven that in the colonial courts. So our history is very accurate, and we know beyond any certainty. And the fact that we haven't moved, we're still occupying the same lands we did in excess of 8,000 years ago, before the pyramids, before Jesus. And like, for us not to know that there was these nations here is ridiculous at best.
Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have an incredible day, and we'll see you next time.